Hello, Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if New Orleanians want to experience outdoor restaurant dining these days, they will have to cross the border to neighboring parishes as different mandates came down this week from different levels. We'll look at the rules and the objections, as well as the Archdiocese filing for bankruptcy, the plight of Carnival, banking examined, Ray Nagin sprung from prison, and progress on the Hard Rock demolition. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, managing editor for investigations, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Kath Finn, freelance journalist and business columnist for New Orleans Magazine. And David Hammer, reporter, investigative reporter, WWL TV Channel 4. And we are going to go over to David first. And David, we just want an update on you personally. How are you feeling? Because you had COVID and you had a rough time with it.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, I'm feeling a lot better. This week was great because I was able to get back out there and report again. Feel like I'm contributing to getting important information out there. And it's really great to feel like I've got this completely behind me.
Also, you and I were discussing that a little bit before we started to roll tape. You actually were able to get an antibody test. So, how could you, because those are hard to come by right now. And what was found out about you in terms of antibodies?
Well, I took actually 3 different antibody tests by drawing blood and having them run in different ways. They're these little cassettes that show a quick test within 10 minutes, actually sending it off to a laboratory. And I did all 3, and I tested positive for antibodies in all. So theoretically, that would mean that I have immunity, but we're still kind of learning about that, and we'll see what that means going forward.
Well, I guess personally that must make you feel a little bit more comfortable now.
Yes, but I don't want to take any unnecessary risks. And most importantly, I don't want to put anybody else at risk. I am actually getting a test done right now just to make sure that I'm completely clear of the virus so that I don't put anybody else at risk. So I'm still not interacting with people in any kind of close proximity.
Right. In terms of antibody tests, too, we're not so certain about really the efficacy of them yet, are we?
Right. I mean, if they,
out there.
What I'm told is if they act like antibodies for other coronaviruses and other related viruses, then it will give me and anybody who may have been an asymptomatic carrier have some kind of immunity. But they're still studying that, I'm told, at the highest levels.
Right. All right, David, we're just so glad that you're feeling better. That's really, really good news, and that you're back out there reporting, because there still is a lot of stuff to report, one of which is the Hard Rock, and that's a story you've been covering for all of these months. Now we see that demolition might actually be starting.
Yeah, there's some very good news on Wednesday that it was a deadline set by the court, Judge Kern Reese at Civil District Court, for the city and the owners of the Hard Rock Hotel project, 1031 Canal Development, principal owner Mohan Kalis, judge to try to come to some kind of agreement by Wednesday. And it didn't look like things were going very well based on court filings and some contentious disputes at a previous hearing. But on Wednesday at the hearing, they announced that they did have a agreement, and that the city was able to issue a permit with conditions that they have to meet for additional insurance coverage and answering specific questions about risks that will come with this demolition. But it looks like they'll be able to start getting their equipment in place starting as early as next week.
Now,
David,
we've heard
those,
okay, go ahead, Errol.
Yeah, those so-called those historic buildings nearby, which I understand they still need the approval of the Landmark Commission. Do they have any chance, or is that a resolved issue already?
That appears to be a resolved issue, that they're going to come down and that they have to come down as a part of this. That is what is approved now officially in the plan by the city safety and permits. But like you said, the HDLC has some role to play in this, because Those are one is a historic theater, and there's other historic values on those properties. So conceivably, the HDLC could put up some kind of a roadblock, and I'm trying to get information on that as we speak.
David, we had heard that with the demolition that the first target would be for those top floors, but also to capture the remains, to get the remains of those two individuals who are still in there, who were killed in the initial collapse. Is that what's going to happen?
Right. Yeah. Jose Ponce Areola and Quignon Wimberly's remains remain in the structure under a lot of debris, not possible to get to them in the condition that the building is in right now. But the plan is in place by the demolition contractors to get at them, but they're going to do it through a third party, it says in the plan. So they're going to have to hire another entity to come in and actually extract the bodies. And there's going to be public entities involved in that process too. So that's going to be very delicate, but that's not going to be part of the first phase. The first phase is getting down those tower crane, that one, particularly that one that's going over Canal, slightly over Canal Street side. And then there would be taking down those three neighboring buildings. And then as a part of the process of bringing down the top 10 floors that are steel structure collapse, that's when they're going to get in there and delicately extract the bodies.
Thanks so much, David. Now let's go on over to Gordon. And, we've heard from the governor. He's been updating us now about, the status of our stay-at-home order, et cetera. Maybe some things relaxed a little bit. But sort of generally, what are we finding now in our region, in the state, in terms of infections for coronavirus, fatalities? Are we starting to see this leveling out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers have been really pretty encouraging they've been all trending in a positive direction. Of course, we're still one of the hardest hit areas in the country. The worst hit area has been New York City and the environs, without a doubt. But our curve, as they call it, has been flattened for a while and continues to trend pretty positively. If you look at almost any measure, whether it's new infections or deaths or hospital usage, all of those things, the worst seems to be behind us, and it seems like the social distancing policies have really had an impact. And now the question is really, when is it safe to start letting people go back to some of the things that they'd like to start doing again, like working and going to restaurants and bars and so forth. And that's where you're starting to see a little bit of the tension develop over how quickly we can do those things. And even within that, say when you allow restaurants to reopen, under what conditions. So, we're starting to allow restaurants to have some outdoor dining, for instance. And we're moving a little less quickly perhaps than some of our neighboring states. But also it's worth remembering that we've had a bigger epidemic of the coronavirus here than most of our neighboring states have had.
With dining, the caveat was, people no table service, basically. They can get their food, and if there are outside tables, and they have to be properly spaced apart, and serving staff have to be masked, et cetera. So, like I said, there are some caveats to it. And, he said we're sticking with them, mid-May, and the city of New Orleans is also. He's receives, though, some objections to that from some GOP members of the legislature, which he responded to yesterday, saying this is kind of silly.
Yeah, I mean, like everything in America, I guess this has turned into sort of a partisan political issue these days. And you see it all across the country where, Democrats and progressives are erring more on the side of human health, and you're seeing a big pushback on the right to let's let the economy, let's get people back to work. And everybody says we should listen to the science, but I mean, it's a very difficult issue, and there's going to be all kinds of second guessing afterwards. But I think our governor has erred more. He's been more in line with Democrats around the country. Perhaps, him being a centrist, he's kind of in between, he's kind of in the middle on this too. And, he met with the president this week, who was very complimentary of his handling of this whole thing. And it seemed like they were on the same page, which I think gives John Bel Edwards a little bit of political cover within Louisiana. But he is taking some heat from the legislature and some members of Congress, Clay Higgins in particular.
Yeah, it seems like he's following the Trump's playbook. If you think
Right.
it was only a few months ago during the election when Trump was campaigning against Edwards, and on election night when Edwards says about Trump, bless his heart, in kind of a sarcastic sort of way. Now they were the best of friends, and that was the love-in at the White House that they had.
Yeah.
And they were both praising each other.
Yeah, and I actually think they've gotten along fine pretty much throughout John Bel Edwards, throughout this presidency. But there was a brief period there where Trump was really trying hard to get a Republican elected when he said a lot of pretty critical things of John Bel Edwards. But before that and since then, they seem to have gotten along just fine.
Okay, so basically we still right now are urged to stay at home. Just continue to wash your hands, be careful. We've not broken through it yet.
Right. I think we'll start to see more loosening in a couple of weeks.
Okay. All right, Gordon, thanks a lot. Let us go to Kathy right now. And what is this whole coronavirus situation, COVID-19? How has it impacted our banks, the banking industry?
Well, we got a big indicator of that this week, Marcia, with banks across the country, the major banks, the largest ones in the country, reporting their earnings for the first quarter of the year, which ended March 31st. And what we saw was a lot of declines in profits across the board. And I can see that you could look at this as a very important economic indicator, actually, because the thing that was causing the declines in profit almost across the board is the fact that these banks were boosting their reserves and increasing their cushion against potential losses in their loan portfolio. And they're all worried, clearly. The largest banks collectively added some $35 billion to their existing reserves against those losses. And so that's an indicator of what they see coming ahead. And that was, as I said, that was just through March 31st. So what we saw here in New Orleans, again, we saw a repeat of what was going on at the national level. And we saw, for instance, Hancock Whitney reported a pretty steep loss for the quarter. And it was for the same reason. They really boosted their reserves against potential losses. And increasing, here in New Orleans and South Louisiana and in several other states, of course, it's kind of a double whammy, because it's not just the coronavirus by itself that's affecting the banks. It's the oil and gas industry. Even before the virus came along, the oil and gas industry was having difficulties, and there were losses. We saw that in companies all across America. And so the banks were paying close attention to what was going on with that industry even before the virus struck. We were seeing oil prices very depressed, of course, and we've seen them go even lower, almost kind of amazingly low in the past week or so. So the banks here in New Orleans and across South Louisiana are worried not only about the impact of the virus on all of their borrowers, but even more so with the oil and gas industry. Whitney attributed the loss, part of this loss this quarter, to a couple of bankruptcies in the oil and gas industry. And they wrote off $10 million of loans related to those bankruptcies. And they clearly expect more of this. So again, as I said, it's an economic indicator and a very important one, because these bankers clearly are worried about the future. I should emphasize that the banks themselves are not in big trouble. They do have the capital available to them. They've taken the steps the regulators have forced them to do all along. They're at very good, very strong capital levels. And we're not looking at a banking crisis right now. We're looking at the banks preparing for crises in other industries. And they're doing what they need to do. We can expect that they will continue to scrutinize those loan portfolios and in many cases reclassify loans from the performing category to what they call the underperforming. And there could even be defaults. I think they've probably already seen a few defaults.
All righty, Kathy, thanks a lot. Appreciate that. Errol, we're going to go over to you right now. And the Mayor Cantrell said, well, we can't say perhaps there won't be a Mardi Gras in 2021, which really shocked a lot of people. So where do we stand now with this?
Especially coming the same day that people were mourning it not being a Jazz Fest day, because it would have been Jazz Fest. And two very important cultural institutions were being doubted, and especially with the Jazz Fest has been rejected twice because it was rescheduled for October. But all this happened almost the same day when Ray Nagin, I know we're going to talk about him later, when he was freed. And it reminded me when he was mayor right after Katrina. One night he went to the North Shore and was talking to a group of New Orleans expatriates, and someone raised the question, how can people talk about Mardi Gras when there's so much suffering going on in New Orleans? And Nagin said, well, maybe you got a point there. Well, there were TV cameras there, and that wound up being the lead story in all the TV news. And I don't think Nagin meant it to be that way. I think he was playing to the audience. And so the next day, Nagin against Mardi Gras. And again, he kind of backtracked on it. In this case, Mayor Cantrell was in New York or Washington, and she was talking to the national media, and kind of as an afterthought, the question was asked about Mardi Gras. And what she said was, that's something that needs to be put on the table, which is somewhat short of an endorsement of it. And then and talked about something we really need to think about. Well, that of course makes big news. Mardi Gras is an international level type celebration. And anytime it hits a bump, it makes international news. And when it makes international news, it reflects on the city. So quickly, it became a huge news story. And the problem is that, of course, Mardi Gras is very lucrative. And I know we get these arguments about health versus the economy, but the planning is early. The people that ride in those big crews, a lot of them are from out of town, and they're deciding right now if they're coming, and the people who are tourists. And so it did cause a bit of a furor and a lot of concern. So the question is still out there, and it comes to mind is in 1979. And by the way, you can't cancel Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is a date on the calendar. Which you can cancel is the events associated with Mardi Gras, which would be the parades and everything. But in 1979, the parades were canceled because of a police strike. And so that's the first time in modern times when there weren't any parades or activity. Some of those parades went to Jefferson Parish. The big ones did, and that could be the case that would happen here if for some reason the parades were canceled. But with nothing to say, but quickly, that same day, John Bell Edwards had a press conference, and he was asked about Cantrell's statement. He had not heard him at the time, but the reporter repeated the statement, and Edwards says, it's too early to talk about that now. He says, I don't even talk about events in the fall yet. This is next year, and so we don't talk about it. And I think that tends to be the prevailing opinion. I think everybody agrees that there's a lot to learn, and there could be some reasons why we would want to have Carnival, but it's just a little bit too early to talk about it. So that seems to be the opinion and the advocate of the editorial today that raised that same sort of opinion. So the issue is out there, some people to think about, but boy, it would sure be discouraging to a lot of people if, in fact, if the Carnival events were canceled, especially this far ahead of time.
All right. Okay, E. All right. Well, we'll just see how things play out. Thanks a lot, E. Gordon, back over to you. We learned that the Archdiocese of New Orleans has filed for bankruptcy. What has happened?
Yeah, I mean, when it rains, it pours, right? One thing after another. There's been some signs of financial trouble at the Archdiocese that we've been writing about over the last couple of years, but this came as a little bit of a surprise. We're not the first city to see its Catholic Archdiocese or diocese declare bankruptcy. This is about, I think, the 20th or 25th diocese in the country to do it out of a couple hundred dioceses around the country. It seems to be a function of one of the things, of course, is the various lawsuits that have been filed against abusive priests, which are creating obviously a cloud over their finances, not knowing how much they're going to have to pay out in settlements and so forth. And in the bankruptcy, I think the important thing, or what I assume most people are wanting to understand, and what we're trying to report on and help people understand is, what does this mean for Catholics? So we have we have about 500,000 Catholics in the New Orleans area, and people want to know, does this mean that they're not going to have mass anymore? What is it? And the church officials are telling us right now, it's not going to make a meaningful difference in what you experience as a Catholic in terms of, church services, even which churches remain open, that sort of thing. I'm talking about when we get out of the pandemic, at least. And they're saying this is just a way to sort of work things out with some of their creditors and to afford them some protection there. And we're doing some reporting. We'll have a story in Sunday's paper about what the experiences of some other cities have been that have gone through this. I think Minneapolis is a big city that's gone through it, Buffalo, some places like that. And we'll hopefully have some more to share with people about what this might look like.
Mm-hmm.
It probably resonates a little bit more. It probably resonates a little bit more here because New Orleans is such an historically Catholic city that for a long time that was with the Spanish and the French population, so much of our culture is a reflection of the Catholic heritage from Mardi Gras to St. Patrick's Day and St. Joseph's Day, and so I probably feel it a little bit more. And then of course we have a lot of churches too, and
Right.
They're all handsome buildings. A lot of them are being converted to something else.
Right. I mean, certainly we're
didn't they have this after Katrina, where they had to contract some of the parishes because of filing for bankruptcy?
Yeah, that's a good point. So after Katrina, there was something, and that may have been more dramatic than this will be, but there was a contraction where they closed about 20 churches or parishes and merged them with others, and they sold off some of those as a way of raising some money. There's one in my neighborhood. It was a church that wasn't getting a lot of attendance, and that was sold, and it's now luxury condos. And I think those are ways that the church can shore up its finances. They're saying there's nothing like that contemplated at this time with the bankruptcy, but that's always a possibility that they could decide they don't need quite as many church buildings, and that could be a way for them to raise some cash if they need it.
So you guys at the paper are going to be looking into this a little bit more. So we'll be learning
Absolutely.
more shortly. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Gordon. David, let's go over to you right now real quick. Ray Nagin was let out of jail, out of prison, his full term not served. What happened there?
Well, he was sentenced in 2014 and started serving a 10-year sentence in September 2014. And he only made it 5.5 years of that time. And traditionally in federal prison, the prisoners serve 85% and can be eligible to get out under supervised release if they're for good behavior at 85% of their prison term. But he was able to get out earlier because of this COVID-19 release program that was announced by the Department of Justice, and he appealed to the Bureau of Prisons directly to allow him to get out, and he was able to go to home confinement at his home in Frisco, Texas. But, this story was actually broken by Gordon Russell, as he broke so many stories about the issues that Ray Nagin was involved with back in 2007, 2008, 2009 at the paper. So he could probably give us more details.
Over to you, Gordon.
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, it was a surprise given that a lot of, there's been this direction from the Attorney General to let as many people out as possible as it's safe to do under sort of a compassionate release program. But there haven't been a lot of people let out yet. So it was a little surprising that he was one of them. But that said, he's obviously a nonviolent offender, and he served more than half of his time. He's in his 60s, which means he's at some risk from the coronavirus. I mean, some elevated risk compared to some other prisoners. So I don't know about you, David. I got a lot of different reactions to this story in terms of, some people are still very angry and wanted to see him serve every last day of his sentence. And a lot of other people, even if they're still angry in some ways at him, are like, what's the point? And he served his time, and he's been broken financially, and he's not a danger to society, and of course he should be let out.
Let me just jump in real quick, and it is home confinement, though. He will be under home confinement, right? Is that for the remainder of his sentence?
I believe, David, you may know more about this than me. David and I did some of this work together, and I feel like the answer from the Bureau of Prisons wasn't completely clear. But
right, it seemed unlikely that he would be forced to go back to prison, but they didn't say definitively one way or the other. It is important to point out that the prison that he was in, a low security prison in Texarkana, Texas, had not had any reported cases of COVID-19.
All right, I'm going to have to wrap you up a little bit on that, David. Let's finish up right now. Starting with E, there's other news happening out there. Let's just do a real quick reporting of that. E.
Well, I think this week we had the two CEOs of the two major parks send public letters saying we need help financially. And both parks are very, very important now because of their recreation capacity. So a lot of people are going to them, but they can't spend any money because none of the concessions are open. So we saw a real plea from the parks this week.
So the parks need help. All right, Gordon, let's go over to you.
I'll just mention real quick, the Bonnie Carey Spillway closed today after being open for about a month. It was the, I think, 6th opening in the last 10 years, and it's kind of become a worrisome trend in terms of how often it has to be open and what it does to the lake, and more broadly, what the constant openings have to say about climate change.
Right. All right, Gordon, thanks. Kathy, you, quick.
Yeah, GE Corporation this week announced a big round of layoffs and cutbacks across the nation. The impact of that here in New Orleans is that they are closing the GE Tech Center in downtown New Orleans, where 100 people are employed. That center's been there. It opened in 2012, and it's important because it shows that the cutbacks are hitting the tech industry as well as others.
David.
And we need to keep an eye on government tax collections and government finances going forward, because they're losing a lot too with the oil and gas problems and business problems.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us from your various locations for Informed Sources. Thank you all too, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.